Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our second webcast in our two-part series on transformational conservation. Today, we'll be talking about ocean conservation. My name is Allison Murdoch Haslam, and I'm a Legacy Club Stewardship Manager at the Nature Conservancy. I'm based in Santa Barbara, California, and would like to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral homelands of the Barbaño Band of the Chumash people. So I'm interested to see where you're all joining us from. So let's go ahead and share our poll results. All right, wow, cool. Okay, so I think everybody can see this and I'm really excited. We currently have 540 people on the call so far and climbing, and it looks like we have the most people on the United States West, but a good representation from the rest of the country. And hello, it looks like we have 4 people joining us from Latin America and Caribbean. So welcome everybody. We're so excited to have you all here. I want to send a warm welcome to our Legacy Club members, trustees, and loyal supporters who are joining us today. The forward-thinking commitment of our Legacy Club members and the generous annual support of our loyal donors make the critical work we're talking about today possible. We're only successful because of your support, so thank you. I know you're all excited to hear from our speaker, but before I introduce her, I want to make sure everyone's familiar with the Zoom features we'll be using today. First, everyone's cameras and mics are turned off. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a toolbar with several options. On the far right, you can click on the CC icon to launch closed captioning. In the middle, you'll see a Q&A icon. Please click on this button to submit your questions anytime throughout the presentation for our speaker. After the presentation, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. You'll also notice a chat icon, which is where my colleagues will share helpful links and additional resources with you throughout our event. And finally, we will be recording today's presentation and sharing with everyone after. I'm now pleased to introduce you to our featured speaker. Melissa Garvey, Global Managing Director of Ocean Protection, is joining us from Colorado to take us on a deeper dive into how TNC is protecting nature at the scale our planet needs for both people and nature to thrive. Melissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Allison, and I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with all of you today. I'll note I'm also a Legacy Club member, and I want to thank all of you for the support that you give to the Nature Conservancy as well. As Allison mentioned, I am the Global Director of Ocean Protection for the Nature Conservancy, and in this role, I oversee all of our ocean protection, coastal resilience, coastal wetland, and reef system work. And some of you may have heard from one of my other colleagues at one of the earlier presentations where he shared about what the Nature Conservancy is doing in protection generally and how we're working to achieve 2030 biodiversity goals. And I'm here to talk specifically about oceans and the work that we're doing to support those 30 by 30 goals to protect our oceans, and more specifically to deep dive into how we're using the latest science, how we're empowering local partners and communities, and deploying innovative financing so that we can protect and restore coral reefs, oyster reefs, and coastal wetlands in large expanses of ocean. But first, let's take a little step back. Let's go to our first slide, Allison. So I know many of you are familiar with the Nature Conservancy. You know likely that our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all lives depends. And we're working towards this ambitious goal by focusing on really 2 key areas of conservation: conserving oceans, freshwater, and lands, as well as promoting climate change mitigation, as well as adaptation. Next slide. And many of you also know that we work very broadly. TNC works in 72 countries and territories around the world, on 6 continents, and in every US state and territory. And likewise, our ocean work also spans the globe, from the South Pacific to the Caribbean to the Western Indian Ocean. And we're working to protect habitats by developing and applying those good ideas locally that can then be adapted and brought to scale in other places. Next slide. So let's dive into the oceans. No matter where we live, and from the poll we see that there's people from all over on this call, but no matter where we live, oceans make our lives better. Oceans provide 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. And over 3 billion people on the planet depend on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihoods. Meanwhile, coral reefs and oyster beds provide not just wonder of the natural systems, but they also help protect us. They protect us by breaking up wave energy and storm surges. And even on the edges of the ocean, in the coastal wetlands, areas such as salt marshes, seagrasses, meadows, and mangroves, they help mitigate climate change. They draw in carbon as they grow, and they transfer that into the rich soils that are held by their roots. The stored carbon can then remain in the soil for thousands of years. And in fact, coastal wetlands are an even much better carbon sink than rainforests. Next slide. But we also know that the world is changing fast. And over the next 30 to 40 years, the development pressures will be intense. As the world grows on a planet with 9 billion people, meeting the needs and demands for food, energy, and water are going to be very important and put a lot of pressure on the world's oceans. We know that already more than 60% of all of the fisheries around the world are in decline or are overfished. And meanwhile, the changing climate is leading to even more intense storms. It's leading to higher sea levels, higher ocean temperatures, as well as increased flooding in coastal areas. These coastal areas are under intense threat, and we're losing them faster than any other habitat as well. And with half the world's population either living on or near coastlines, this is impacting our food, our livelihoods, and our safety. Meanwhile, in the high seas, the areas beyond national borders, they're completely unregulated and unprotected. We've come to the conclusion that we need to act now, and we must protect our oceans while we're also meeting the demands for food and jobs. And we must safeguard the coastal populations while we're reducing the risk of climate change. Well, how do we do that? Next slide. Our vision at the Nature Conservancy is to work with partners around the world and apply the latest science and test new approaches to change the way that oceans are used and managed. Our vision is to be building healthy oceans, resilient coastlines, ensuring that there's thriving communities with sustainable food choices, and that there's strong marine management that's grounded in science. Next. The areas of focus that we focus on at the Nature Conservancy are really 3 key areas for oceans. And while we're working around the world and in every US coastal state, those efforts are really centered on ocean protection, coastal resilience and adaptation, as well as sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. Now, I'm really going to be focusing on these, the first 2 for the most of our talks. At a later date, hopefully there'll be an opportunity to dive more into fisheries and aquaculture, but I'm happy to answer a few questions on that later. Let's go to the next slide. So the ocean protection work that the Nature Conservancy does is focused on preserving and restoring healthy ocean systems, and that's done in partnership with coastal communities and governments around the world. And this work has 3 key approaches. First, we're protecting and restoring coral reefs, oyster reefs, and coastal wetlands. We're sharing the latest science and empowering local partners. And finally, we're developing innovative financing to ensure that this work can last into the future. We want to make sure it's durable. Next. So first up, let's talk about how we're protecting and restoring reefs. The Conservancy is working with communities around the world to establish new marine protected areas, as well as improve the management of existing ones. And the goal here is to be specifically focused on protecting coral reefs that are resilient in the face of climate change impacts, such as warming seas. So we're also restoring oyster reefs in addition to coral reefs, so that we can ensure that the many benefits that they provide, like coastal protection and water filtration, as well as food, are available long into the future. As part of this work, we're also mapping ocean resources so that countries can make better plans on how to protect these critical habitats. And we're also using cutting-edge science to restore the health of damaged coral reefs while promoting the genetic diversity that increases the resilience to climate change threats at the same time. Next slide. So partnerships are always at the core of what we do, and it's no different with reefs. So to scale up our reef work, we're partnering with communities, governments, we're partnering with NGOs, researchers, as well as the private sector as well, and ensuring that younger generations are also included in these efforts, as they're going to be the ones inheriting the responsibility for conserving reefs. And I want to highlight specifically our Reef Resilience Network. And because it's through this network that we're deploying new techniques in reef protection and restoration. And the network currently includes members from about 75% of the world's coral reef countries and territories. And our goal over the next 5 years is to reach a coverage of 100% of the coral reef countries in the world. What's important is that through these partnerships, we're also able to drive very ambitious national as well as global policies that can increase the marine protected areas in the world while also reducing threats and improving reef management. Next. For coastal wetlands, and when I talk about coastal wetlands, I'm talking about mangroves, I'm talking about seagrasses and tidal marshes. These coastal wetlands, they provide habitat for fish and crabs and food, and they also provide sources like local livelihoods for people. In addition, though, these coastal wetlands, they protect the coastlines by absorbing wave energy and providing storm protection. And by doing so, they can save communities hundreds of millions of dollars when severe weather strikes, and they can reduce flood damage by up to 29%. Meanwhile, at the same time, coastal wetlands also trap billions of tons of blue carbon. And by that, we mean the ability to be mitigating carbon within any of these coastal areas. And they can do it in concentrations of up to 10 times higher than terrestrial forests. So protecting and restoring coastal wetlands can help protect millions of people while also providing the different benefits such as healthy fisheries and water purification, as well as improved local livelihoods. And again, we're working with partners across the globe on our coastal wetlands efforts to create new approaches to change the way that coastal wetlands are used and managed. Let me give you one example in the next slide. So blue carbon in coastal wetlands, it provides a really unique opportunity for climate finance. So if coastal wetlands are restored, if we restored even a quarter of these habitats, we could add 10 million hectares of carbon trapping wetlands to our coastlines. Now, that's an area about the equivalent size to Iceland, very large. But in addition to restoration, if we were protecting existing coastal wetlands, we could prevent the release of 80 million tons of carbon emissions currently being stored by these habitats. So TNC has been working with international experts to develop the science as well as the flood modeling and carbon and resilience methodologies that are needed to create what we're calling a blue carbon resilience credit. This is the first of its kind because these credits support not just carbon mitigation, but we can also demonstrate quantifiable resilience benefits, flood reduction, that are associated with coastal wetlands. And so we've identified the first set of projects for blue carbon resilience credits across the US and globally, and we hope to be bringing our first supply of blue carbon resilience credits to market in 2022. Let's go to the next slide. So mangrove conservation is also one of the ways that we're integrating community partnerships and gender equity into our work. And the strategy is currently being implemented in various places like Papua New Guinea, Micronesia, Indonesia, and Kenya. And I gotta say, this is one of my favorite photos, and I wanna tell you a little bit about the story that this is telling. So this photo was taken in the Lamu archipelago, and it's home to the largest intact mangrove forest in northern coast of Kenya. And so these mangroves, we know that they're really critical to coastal development and coastal resilience. And about 8% of the population lives along the coast, and coastal tourism accounts for more than 60% of Kenya's tourism economy. So this is a really important space. And the mangroves are integral to coastal Kenya for protecting both the fragile coastlines and communities, as well as helping any of the fisheries in that area thrive. They also help enhance biodiversity. They provide fuel wood and traditional medicines. And they also help with sustaining livelihoods and providing local community employment. And yet, like we see in so many places, unfortunately, the major drivers of loss for these mangroves are what we see in many places: overexploitation of wood products, conversion pressures to other land uses, pollution effects, climate change, the list goes on. And in Kenya, mangrove loss has been pretty dramatic. They've lost about 22% of their mangroves since 1992, and about 40% of their mangrove area is now degraded. Kenya has done a good job developing a national mangrove ecosystem management plan, but what's been lacking is the really site-specific management plans that have strong community participation. So what we did is we began working with local partners, partners like the Northern Rangeland Trust, the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Institute, as well as the Kenya Forest Service. And we worked with them to support and strengthen capacity of Kenya's community conservancies. And the idea there is to help them better protect, restore, and better manage any of the priority mangrove habitats in this area where 60% of Kenya's mangroves are found. And what I'm so excited about and what this picture shows to me is that, we've been spending a lot of time helping ensure that community members can be trained. We've trained over 50 community members, most of them women, and planted over 20,000 mangroves on roughly 25 hectares to date. Now, it's an early start, but what we're doing is coupling this effort with helping improve community policing and protection of mangrove areas from human activities, and helping to strengthen any of the ongoing community surveillance and enforcement mechanisms so that we can protect any of the rehabilitated sites and help control the unregulated exploitation of mangroves. So what excites me about these sorts of bottom-up approaches is that we're really helping to both create and equip these community-led groups with the authority to own, manage, and truly benefit from the healthy fisheries and coastal systems, in addition to the other benefits that these mangrove areas provide. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to tell you about something somewhat completely differently, but it's also related, and that's the Global Mangrove Watch. So this really is just, highlighting the work that we're doing in science and partnerships. And what we're doing with the Global Mangrove Watch is, frankly, we're just building the scientific case for wetlands conservation. And this is a partnership between the Nature Conservancy, Wetlands International, and others, where we launched this effort called the Global Mangrove Watch, which is an innovative partnership that deploys the technology and science to map real-time trends in mangrove loss and develop targeted protection plans. And so this online platform can help coastal governments protect, manage, restore mangroves and other areas and help secure those benefits that mangroves provide. What I'm excited about is these kinds of top-down tools are now being deployed and helping with conservation projects on the ground, like the picture I showed you in Kenya, where our community partners there can now use they can use these types of platforms to be monitoring any changes in mangrove condition, to be able to plan their patrols to prevent illegal logging in any of the threatened mangrove areas. Next slide, please. So this is another one of the key approaches that we're using, which is innovative finance. And so at TNC, we firmly believe that nature is the smartest commercial investment that business or government can make. And as a result, we have a very strong focus on developing innovative ways to finance ocean conservation projects now as well as into the future. Next slide. And let me tell you about sort of one of the flagship projects we have in oceans, which is one of TNC's key innovative financing approaches. And this is our Blue Bonds project. So in 2019, we launched a very ambitious vision called Blue Bonds for Ocean Conservation. And this is a project that I lead. And at the heart of this, really, it's quite simple. It's just a basic deal. Coastal nation commits to protecting about 30% of their nearshore ocean areas, and that could include coral reefs, mangroves, fisheries, or other important habitats. And in exchange, we restructure a nation's sovereign debt. What this does is it leads to lower interest rates and longer repayment periods. So the government is then able to use the savings to capitalize a conservation trust fund that can support new marine protected areas that the country has committed to create. So TNC's role is somewhat simple. We assemble the deals, which aren't so simple, but we use our science and marine planning expertise to help design the system of protected areas. And we also help create the trust fund that holds government accountable to these commitments. So we're ensuring that the Blue Bonds finance real conservation and not just paper parks. Next slide. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we first, the first pilot project we had, which was in the Seychelles, where we tested this idea in 2016. And so in exchange for the country's commitment to protect 30% of its coastal waters, we restructured the Seychelles national debt and allowed them to direct new payments to protect reefs, fisheries, and coastlines. And so the way that it works is the government repays the restructured loans to the local conservation trust fund, and a portion of those payments are directed to marine conservation. And I'm really excited to say that on March 26, 2020, Seychelles reached a really key milestone, and the Seychelles president had announced the legal designation of new protected areas that are going to increase the Seychelles marine protection, going from what had been less than 1% of its ocean territory to now having protection over 30% of its ocean. And that's an area the size of Germany. And meanwhile, the trust fund that was created continues to provide those grants for ocean protection projects, even during the COVID crisis. So it's really serving as a critical source of funding at a time when tourism income is otherwise declining. Next slide. And what I'm most excited about is this project that we piloted in the Seychelles can really be replicated in many different places. And so building on the success of the project in the Seychelles, we now have efforts underway, Blue Bonds project efforts underway in coastal countries in Africa and Latin America, as well as in the Caribbean. So this strategy, what it does is it creates durable conservation at scale. And with it, we are planning to be able to protect about 4 million square kilometers of ocean over the next 5 years. And that's a 15% increase in the total amount of protected ocean on the planet today. We're going to have half of these protected areas go into no-take zones as well, so that we can help the fish stocks recover. And I'm really excited about the scale of the financial benefits, because we're able to drive about $1.6 billion into sustainable finance for ocean conservation. All right, let's switch gears. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I want to share a little bit about what we're doing in coastal resilience efforts as well. So our coastal resilience effort, it really is sort of the intersection between protection and addressing climate change efforts. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of people who live in the world's coastlines. It's about half of the world's population. But whether it's poorly planned development or the growing climate threats, such as rising sea levels, more dangerous storms, all of these things really are threatening the property and the lives and livelihoods, and in some cases, even entire economies of these coastal areas. So we're really focusing on our efforts on building coastal resilience and adaptation, and we're doing that with 3 key strategies. One is ensuring nature. The second is partnering with coastal communities. And the third is helping plan for climate disasters. Go to the next slide. And this first one is ensuring nature. And I know that this one's a little tricky to wrap your head around, but stick with me for a moment. So as I mentioned before, we know that that coral reefs, oysters, mangroves, seagrasses, even sand dunes, that they serve as barriers that absorb wave energy, and they help prevent coastal erosion. And at the same time, they provide habitat for marine life and provide a lot of these benefits for people like food security, jobs, and recreation. So protecting and restoring these natural areas is a vital part of addressing climate change threats. So an example of that is what we were able to do in 2019, which is we partnered with the insurance industry to really essentially just change the whole paradigm and drive a business case for protecting nature for the resilience benefits that it provides. And so, as I mentioned, in 2019, we worked in Quintana Roo, Mexico, and developed the world's first coral reef insurance policy for hurricane damage. What that does is, working with the insurance industry, we were able to create an insurance policy for the coral reef itself, because we could quantify and model from an insurance standpoint what that coral reef, the benefits that it could provide as far as the resilience and protection that it provided to the coastal community that was so heavily dependent on tourism. And this policy was actually triggered recently because of it when a hurricane swept through that area in October. And the payout has gone to help restore any damage to those reefs. So we're trying to then build on this success as well, and we're working to bring reef insurance to other geographies, bring it to Hawaii and Florida, as well as Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, Indonesia, as well as the Philippines. And we're also looking at expanding this strategy to investigate insurance products that can be used for additional risk, like coral bleaching or other ecosystems like mangroves. Next slide. And back to our roots, we're also partnering with communities. So our coastal resilience work is focused on working with communities around the world to both assess the climate risks in those places, but also to take action to protect their coastlines. Let me just give you a couple real quick examples. In Mexico, Central America, and Micronesia, we've helped establish and train what we call reef brigades. So these are local residents that are kind of first responders who can help repair coral reefs after any storm damage. We're working in Florida where we're launching a pilot project to minimize flood impacts in a Miami neighborhood by restoring the mangroves and constructing a natural berm. We've got similar related efforts going on in Micronesia and Indonesia, where we're also working with communities and helping them address climate change risks by reducing erosion and protecting mangroves, and helping assist with climate vulnerability assessments as well. Let's go to the next slide. But in addition to the work we're doing on insurance, working with communities for our coastal resilience, we're also engaging with some unusual partners, and we're helping with disaster planning. And this is a new area for the environmental community, but we're collaborating with the humanitarian organizations to help them be integrating nature-based solutions into their disaster planning. And one example of this is the work that we're doing with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies to engage and train disaster risk reduction planners, as well as communities and government agencies, so that they're deploying these nature-based solutions to reduce the impacts of climate disasters before they happen. Let's go to the next slide. So I know I've covered a lot today, but I hope you get the sense that really the stakes have never been higher for oceans, but also with the science, expertise, innovation, as well as the right partners, TNC can truly help build a better future for our oceans, as well as the billions of people around the world who rely on them every day. I'm thrilled to have had the opportunity to talk with you, and what I'd really love to do next is open it up and hear what questions you have for me, and hopefully I can answer them.
Thanks, Melissa. That was a great presentation, and it looks like we have a lot of questions already. So a quick reminder to everyone that you can submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And as you continue to submit questions, we'll go ahead and get started with some that were sent in advance. Okay, so for the first question, I know you didn't have a chance to talk about fisheries, but could you talk about it as a high-level overview and how TNC is helping local communities find sustainable ways to harvest fish?
Yeah, so fisheries are such an important component work of any ocean conservation efforts, and there's a whole much broader presentation that can be done on this. But I do just want to highlight what we are doing in a couple places, a couple of the key strategies that we're running from a global perspective. And the first one is called Fish Path, and really what it is I've heard it described as maps.com for fisheries. Which kind of cracks me up. But the idea is that local communities and even at the national level, countries can input a number of different characteristics of the data that they have, and basically set them up with the right sort of tools to help them manage their fisheries. And the idea is that we can kind of right-size fishery management tools and toolkits so that it can really be deployed almost anywhere. Because we know that one of the key challenges to having a robust and healthy fisheries is just being able to have the appropriate data to be able to make the right decision making. The other things that we're working on in the fisheries space is, I mentioned data management. That's huge. Science is another key piece of our work. But then third is sort of taking that science, putting the right technology around it so that we can have better results. By that, I mean, thinking about how we can have a better tracking of vessels and better technology tracking so that we can ensure that the right kind of fish are being caught and harvested on ships, and ensure that we've got the kind of surveillance on vessels to make sure that the fisheries policy is being adhered to. So data management, technology, science, as well as the support that we're doing on a policy standpoint. Whether it's supporting the illegal, unregulated, and underreported fishing efforts that are happening, ensuring that there's science-based policy that's being driven, and then tying that together with good planning and technology to ensure that it be more so. Those are some of the key things that we're doing in fisheries. And I also put in a quick plug for the work that we're doing in aquaculture, which is related to some of our fisheries work, different, but also related. And just recognizing that the importance that that the products have for humans, and finding ways that we can be generating those products in a way that is not just less harmful, but can actually be regenerative to the that they're being looked at. So the aquaculture work that we're doing is focused both on shellfish aquaculture as well as seaweed. And a key example of the integration between our restoration and aquaculture work is a project some of you may have seen on the Today Show, where we realized that a lot of the shellfish producers that we work with, they were really struggling with COVID because the restaurants that they would often sell to weren't no longer open. And so they had a lot of shellfish that they suddenly couldn't sell. So we have worked with NOAA and a number of other partners to develop a plan where we were actually helping source those shellfish that they couldn't sell, and are now using that shellfish in restoration areas along, I think there's maybe 20 different projects that are ongoing in the United States. So it's one of those win-win efforts where we're helping both the shellfish producers, help them when they're in an economic pinch, but also use those resources to be restoring some of the coastal communities along the U.S. as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so it looks like we're getting a lot of questions on coral reefs and protection efforts. So I've sort of got 4 here, so I'll read them all and then I can sort of prompt you as we need.
I'll try and answer them all too.
Okay. So can anything meaningful be done before coral reefs are completely bleached and dead? Can severely degraded reefs be truly restored? Could you expand on strategies and actions TNC is using to protect coral reefs?
Okay, so there's a lot. Let me try and get all
there's
these.
A lot there.
Hold me to it, Allison, if there's a piece I'm not answering. So, what are we doing to protect coral reefs? And I'd say there's sort of a whole slew of things. The key thing is really just having a lot of our large-scale marine protection efforts, for example, what we're doing with blue bonds, have those cover places where reefs exist, and ensuring that there's long-term sustainable financing so that there's as much protection and good management around existing reefs. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is how do we think of, like, can reefs be restored? And the answer to that is it depends, right? Depends exactly what the stresses are on them. Storm damage, absolutely, reefs can be restored. There's a lot of just fantastic examples of restoration efforts that are happening all over the world. But some of the key ones that I got some chance to see underwater were in Mexico that are associated with some of the reef insurance work we're doing, where we're able to literally, I mean, it looks like it's almost like they're super gluing reefs back together and helping, take these pieces of reef that get broken off in storms and help them be regenerative. So that's one. A third piece of the work that we're doing is really thinking about the genetic diversity of reefs as well. And so this is sort of a lot of a deep dive in science that we're engaging in, but there are some coral reefs that we know are more resistant to warming seas than others. And so to the question of, are all reefs doomed? The answer to that, I'd say, is absolutely not. There's a lot of opportunities and reason for hope by taking some of this really innovative science, being able to understand the the particular genetic sequencing and the genetic factors that are associated with reefs that are more resilient, and think about how they could either be, restored in places where there is any damage, but also have those be replicated and grown in new places as well as the oceans heat in various places. So it's complicated. I'm not saying it's easy by any stretch, but I do have a fair amount of hope that between the large scale protection and management efforts, with that durable financing, that having that in place, having there be sort of very strong restoration efforts and deploying new science, that there really is hope for coral reefs. And I got to say, the science is telling me that reefs could no longer exist by the end of my career, and I'm just doing everything I can with me and my teams to make sure that doesn't happen, and ensure that that hope does exist for coral Did I answer them all?
Grateful. I think it did. We're grateful for your and your team's work on that. I think I speak for everybody when I say I really like them. They're very pretty and they serve a good purpose. So the next question is about one of the maps. One of the maps showed protected areas where foreign vessels can't fish. How is that enforced? And can you define the differences in the type of marine protected areas?
Yeah. So let me sort of give I think that map was from the Seychelles. And so let me just give you a little bit of a sense of how we had done the project in the Seychelles. So we worked with the Seychelles and helped facilitate a planning effort that was led by the government, marine spatial planning effort, working with stakeholders that included, it included the fishing industry, it included tourism, it included, just sort of any of your everyday people in Seychelles who were interested in, ensuring these good outcomes would happen for the marine protected areas, and involve them in this multi-stakeholder approach. And this has lasted years. These are not quick efforts, but the concept was that we would be protecting 30% of the Seychelles Ocean and having about half of that 30% protected area go into what we call no-take zones or high protected status. And the idea there is that we could designate on maps places where, for various habitat reasons, it was more important to be protecting and reducing the fishing in those particular areas, areas where there may have been, sort of sensitive habitats, for example, or places we knew that, by protecting them, we could be creating the overall amount of fish stock large scale. And so there were various zonings put in place in the Seychelles by virtue of that marine spatial planning process. So the question is, how do you enforce that? Well, it's also not so simple. Enforcement in marine protected areas is something that we're also spending some very big efforts on, and working with a lot of partners to develop the right sorts of technology that can be deployed. Many of these are, frankly, it's military grade satellite technology, so that countries know who is in any of their oceans. And then it's kind of your standard stuff of having someone in a boat actually go verify and to be doing sort of enforcement. If indeed they're identifying that there's a vessel that's violating any of the terms of those protected areas. But again, it's sort of that top down, using a lot of technology and science and high tech approaches, but also a lot of it sort of just ensuring that the countries that we're working with, by virtue of some of the sustainable financing, also have the resources that are as simple as a person on a boat. They can be ensuring that enforcement takes place.
Great, thank you. The next question is on blue bonds. In the map that we showed of where blue bonds could work, it looked like there weren't any real options for the Northern Hemisphere. Is there a reason why we're not trying to do blue bonds around the US?
Yeah, so we are working on some of them around the U.S. We're not working on any of them in the U.S. And let me just sort of explain. I can go into a little bit of details. This gets wonky really fast, so Allison, I'm going to ask that you stop me if need be. But the way that blue bonds projects work, we're able to restructure national debt by buying that debt at a discount. What it means when we're buying debt at a discount is we're usually working with countries that have high debt loads and have high debt to GDP ratios. So many of these are countries that are less developed. The other key thing is we get what's called political risk insurance that can help take what would seem like a risky transaction and actually normalize it and make it like a standard commercial transaction. And the entities that we're able to get that political risk insurance from are focused on more developing countries. So it's those key factors, both working typically with less developed countries that have high debt loads and poor credit ratings, as well as the fact that we're getting the political risk insurance. All of those factors make it so that it's not a tool that can be used in the U.S. However, I do foresee into the horizon at some point, there being opportunities to think much more expansively about other finance tools. It may not be debt restructuring in the U.S., but what we've seen in other countries is just the ability to be issuing what are called blue bonds. So it's just new debt issuances. A lot of those are being done at the national level, but it's certainly something that we would be exploring, whether that could be done at a subnational level, state level, and sort of more local levels as well. The key concept, though, is just trying to find what are the financial building blocks that could work in any particular area to help those governments meet their needs. And we landed on using debt restructuring for ocean conservation because what we were seeing happen in a lot of different coastal and small island developing countries was that many of them they had fairly small economies. They were very dependent on tourism. And a lot of them were also suffering from a lot of, whether it was hurricane damage or other sort of climate-related storm impacts. And so blue bonds as a concept was really attractive, and because we realized that we could work with what seemed like a challenge for a lot of those governments, which was their debt, and turn it into something that could actually help them finance the conservation goals and the efforts that they were wanting to be investing in the first place, but didn't otherwise have the financial resources.
Great, thank you. That makes sense. So the next question is, do you know what is being done to halt ocean acidification?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting question. So, ocean acidification is a result of climate change and additional carbon dioxide, making the world's oceans, lowering changing the pH, making them more acidic. It's got some really tragic impact, whether it's on shellfish, making, the shellfish shells weak, just making it uninhabitable for a lot of species. So it's a very big challenge. And what we know is sort of step one for dealing with ocean acidification is just addressing climate change writ large. And, so whether that's, sort of curbing impact of and use of fossil fuels, step one, policies that can be reducing, other, whether it's, other pollution that's going into waterways, that would be sort of step two. And then step three, this is where things get really interesting. There's a lot of science and a lot of testing that's being done to mobilize efforts where we may not be able to change ocean acidification everywhere with some of these approaches, but you can certainly address it locally. And by that, I mean, we know that certain seagrasses and seaweeds can help change the pH in various coastal areas. And so by either restoring or planting new new seagrasses and seaweeds, there's an opportunity to be able to create a bit of a sort of a changed microclimate that can benefit, for example, shellfish producers in an area, so that you can lessen the impacts of ocean acidification in that smaller area. It's not something that we can do for the whole ocean per se, but what we can do is be managing some of the the critical damage in key areas by thinking creatively about how we can use the benefits that nature provides and have them work in the places where we're seeing some of those threats.
Cool, that's so interesting. That's very cool. So I think we have time for just a few more questions. One is, what are some of the biggest challenges or obstacles we face in delivering protection strategies?
So, I'd say that there's probably like 2 or 3 key challenges. One is just having there be the understanding and awareness and the importance of it, right? That's usually one. Number 2 would just be having the government willingness, because we're working with government. That's how you get any of the ocean protection efforts in place, the large scale, if you're talking about marine protected areas. And then third is just financing them. A lot of these efforts are very expensive. And, again, when you think about all of the island and coastal countries in the world, a number of them have economies that may be struggling. Some of the ones that have really important habitat. And so it's matching up the opportunities where we can be driving those financial innovations and tools and support, and having that help build the political will. One of the reasons why we've been so excited about the Blue Bond strategy is it can help bring those things together, to bring the financing and sort of work through the policy channels in a way that can really be satisfying the interests and goals of the policymakers who are trying to manage for multiple different objectives of many constituencies. So when we talk about marine protected areas, that would certainly be the issue. And I'd say that overall marine protection, one of the biggest threats is climate change. You can't talk about ocean work without talking about climate. And so, addressing climate issues goes hand in glove with any of the ocean protection efforts that we're doing. And so projects that we have underway are designed for a changing or a future that has a changing climate. To the extent possible, we're trying to embed climate mitigation efforts, whether it's blue carbon in our projects, but also ensuring that we have an eye towards always addressing the climate resiliency and adaptation needs of the communities as well.
Great, thank you. And what is TNC doing about plastics in our ocean?
So TNC, the work that the Nature Conservancy is doing on plastics, there's some really good examples that we have that are coming out of the California chapter that's leading the charge on for the organization. And so the way what they're doing right now, and I hope we can share a link to some of the efforts that are happening in California so the audience can get a better sense about it. But we're really making progress in the fight on plastic waste, and we're doing that in a couple of key areas. There's a strong effort that's going on scientific research, technological innovation, as well as really big policy solutions. And so just to give some examples of that, some of the science is really just trying to understand number one, sort of the scale of the problem and what can be done about it. Whether it's capturing microplastics or macroplastics, but then putting that into the next step, which is what are the innovations, the technological innovations that are needed to either capture any of that plastic, but also think differently about a future that's got much less plastic or no plastic at some point in the future. And so it's then combining that science and that technology and the ability to be supporting those new technologies with driving policy shifts as well. I think it's in 2022, there's an effort that's rolling out in California to be addressing some plastic reduction. So I encourage folks to see what we've got there on the website, learn more what's happening in California. But the way that I've also seen them articulated is, really focusing on the policy advocacy of, voting, using less plastic yourself, and then just helping with cleanup efforts as well as sort of the short-term the short-term actions that we have a lot of people engaged in together, a lot of supporters working with us in that space.
Great, thank you. That segues nicely into our last question of the day. So what can the average person do, including those who don't live on a coast? What can they do to help ocean conservation? And then what makes you hopeful for the future?
Yeah, so there's something that each and every one of us can do every single day. And, you all are here doing step one, which is building your awareness about ocean issues. And I think that that's, perhaps one of the most sort of underutilized efforts that everyone can do. So it starts with an awareness, but then it really does truly move to action. And what can everyone do? Well, we need your support. And by that, I mean, very much support the work that all of you do as members and supporters of the Nature Conservancy. But we need you to use your voice, and we need you to use your choices in the economy, to make better choices for supporting oceans. But most of all, we need your vote to be supporting healthy ocean choices. Because what any one of us does really is not the same as what can get accomplished through large-scale policy efforts that are happening, within a community, within a state, or within a country, and also globally. Which is what gives me hope, and this is what I want to share with and leave everyone with today. I don't know if you all have been seeing this in the news today, but I'm just so excited. This is one of the best days for oceans, not just because I had the opportunity to talk with all of you. But today, what was called the high-level panel for ocean sustainability, this group that was composed of, or is composed of 14 world leaders. They have put forward today, this is so timely, they put forward a new action agenda that underpins having there be sustainably managed oceans around the world, and they themselves have made commitments to be managing their entire oceans in a sustainable way. In these countries, this is what's important. The countries that are signing on to this are Australia, Canada, Chile, Fiji, Ghana, Indonesia, Jamaica, Japan, Kenya, Mexico, Namibia, Norway, Palau, and Portugal. And this is just an enormous effort. There's going to be more information that TNC is going to be rolling out on this. There's some work that TNC has been a part of in its advisory network and contributing to this action agenda. And so you're going to be seeing a statement from our CEO, Jen Morris, on this and our engagement. Really excited to see this rolling out and helping support these governments to achieve that 100% ocean sustainability. So those are the sorts of things that really give me hope. And seeing all of you out here interested in learning more and getting active and involved in ocean conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. That is really exciting. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us today to share an insider's look at how we're protecting our oceans. And thank you to everyone in the audience for sharing your time with us and asking such great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of them. Your feedback is helpful as we continue to plan virtual events for our loyal supporters like you. We've posted a link to a quick survey in the chat window. And I hope you can take a few minutes to provide your candid thoughts on our event by filling it out. If you have any additional questions or there's anything we can help you with, please email us at webcast@tnc.org. And as a reminder, we will be sharing a recording of this event via email, and it will also be available on nature.org in about a week. And we'll also send out some links after this for things that Melissa covered in her presentation. So thank you again for joining us and for your support. Take care, stay safe, and happy holidays.